thrives on hate. Small are the lives of cheats and of liars.
Hello everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Emily Hope Squaxt, Wa'ach Elkston the Kamloops Art Gallery. My name is Emily Hope. I'm the Education and Public Programs Director here at the Kamloops Art Gallery. Before we begin our program, I'd like to take a moment to situate ourselves. The concept of here is somewhat abstract in these virtual gatherings, but for myself and those of you joining us from the regions surrounding the gallery, here is Secwepemcúl'ecw. I've introduced myself today in Secwepemc Nation because that's the language of this land. What we refer to as Kamloops and beyond, spanning over 180,000 square kilometers across the interior plateau of what we call British Columbia, is Secwepemcúl'ecw, the territory of the Secwepemc people. Secwepemcúl'ecw. It is an immense privilege to be a guest on these lands, and I'm so grateful to my teachers, Jessica Arnoose and Sunny Prairie Chicken, for continuing to make space for me in their classrooms, and for their generosity, guidance, and patience. I'm joined today by Secwepemcúl'ecw Restoration and Stewardship Society CEO Angela Kane, and by Sarah Dickson-Hoyle, a PhD candidate and public scholar in the UBC Faculty of Forestry, along with the folks from Collective Broadcast who are managing the tech in the background. Our program will be about an hour in duration, and we'll save some time at the end for questions and conversation. You can submit your questions throughout the talk using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and you're also welcome to chat amongst yourselves and with us through the chat window. I'll begin now by reading a couple of these brief biographies to introduce you to Angela Kane and Sarah Dickson-Hoyle. Angela Kane is the CEO for the Secwepemcúl'ecw Restoration and Stewardship Society. Her role is to implement the vision and mandate of the 8 communities that she advocates for daily. I'll read the mandate. To manage, protect, and revitalize our Tmiuk through unity and Secwepemc values and law. Our laws and way of life come from our connection to Tmiuk. Take care of the land takes care of us. It is our cultural responsibility to ensure we leave a legacy of regenerated lands, enriched and thriving forests, and biodiversity, healthy and abundant wildlife, clean air, and water for future generations. Sarah Dickson-Hoyle is a PhD candidate and public scholar in the UBC Faculty of Forestry. Her research, in partnership with the Secwepemcúl'ecw Restoration and Stewardship Society, as well as 2 of its member Secwepemc communities, is documenting how these communities and their territories are recovering following the 2017 Elephant Hill wildfire, and seeks to support Indigenous-led stewardship and restoration in fire-adapted territories. Please join me in welcoming Angela and Sarah. Thank you both so much for coming today.
Thank you, Emily, for having us, and we're excited to be here and share our wisdom and knowledge. I just want to say thank you, everyone, for coming in and partaking in this presentation today. I would like to acknowledge the fact that I work and I live within the heart of the unceded traditional territory of the Secwepemc Nation. And of course, today I have with me Sarah Dickson-Hoyle, who will be co-presenting and introducing herself shortly. The title of our presentation draws from the words, oh, there we go. Go a little too fast. Healing the land and bringing our people together. This draws from the words of Richardson Indian band's former Cook-Ron Ignis. It was during one of our 2021 strategic planning days that former Cook-Ron emphasized the process of working towards healing the land and bringing our people together. The Secwepemc communities must always be mindful, of their rights, ownership, and jurisdiction to lands and forests, and that the technical work of recovering and restoring the Secwepemcúl'ecw must align with Secwepemc rights and responsibilities to the land. Next. And next we'll be having it'll be a short clip of the video that was developed and produced during 2018. We had put together a Morel mushroom harvesting program, and this video was highlighted as that process, but also to really capture the essence of what these communities were facing before, during, and after the wildfires. So if I can get the gentleman to start the video.
We have an important word, and that word means that if you don't respect the land, look after the land properly, that the land will turn on you. And we see that today, that people are not honoring the land and respecting the land. And so we're seeing, the great fires burning, the great floods that are happening. The land is churning in us because of the lack of respect that's shown to Mother Earth. This is what I tell the government. Look, the way you're managing the land, as far as I'm concerned, you've lost the moral authority to govern the land. We're stepping in, and we're going to show you how the land ought to be managed and protected.
Thank you. That was just a brief introduction into what we were speaking on today. So the the SRSS was founded by 8 communities that were impacted by the Elephant Hill wildfire, who later formed the government-to-government Elephant Hill Wildfire Joint Leadership Council, which was a joint leadership between the province and our 8 communities, chiefs. And from the success of this Elephant Hill Recovery Joint Leadership Council, the participating Secwepemc communities formed what we now call the Secwepemcúl'ecw Restoration and Stewardship Society. Our role is to carry forward the work of the Joint Leadership Council and support our communities in long-term restoration and stewardship. Can I have slide 4, please? The Secwepemcúl'ecw, the unceded territory of the Secwepemc Nation. This is a vast area that extends over 150,000 square kilometers throughout the southern and central BC, from the Columbia River Valley along the Rocky Mountains, west to the Fraser River and south to the Arrow Lakes. This is an interconnected landscape of mountains, valleys, plateaus, and river basins that support significant ecological diversity, from alpine meadows, inland rainforests, and high elevation spruce fir forests, to dry ponderosa pine forests and grassland sagebrush ecosystems in the valley bottoms, like you can see here in this view from the Hat Creek Valley. As Cook B. Ron and Marianne Ignace always emphasize, the Secwepemc knowledge, identity, and ways of being are embedded in the wisdom of language and rooted in long-standing connections to these ancestral landscapes. Slide 5. For the past 3 years, I'm supposed to introduce Sarah. Sarah Dickson will be. Yeah.
So these are landscapes I have come to know through my work with and for Secwepemc communities. And as a settler researcher here in so-called BC, I'm accountable to these communities and their territories. For the past 3 years, I've been working with the Secwepemcúl'ecw Restoration and Stewardship Society and its member communities, documenting how they and their territories are recovering from this fire. Last summer, our crew from UBC spent 4 months working with Bonaparte First Nation Stuktaus, monitoring understory plant recovery across Elephant Hill. When the Sparks Lake fire ignited, we were forced to evacuate our work area and instead spent weeks guided by Bert William around Hat Creek Valley. And this photo here is from up McLean's Road above Cache Creek, and that plume of smoke across the valley is the Tremont Creek fire, which would eventually burn over 60,000 hectares. Just one of many mega fires that would once again devastate Secwepemcúl'ecw, as part of the third worst fire season on record by area burned.
On July 7th, near Ashcroft, the Elephant Hill fire raged for over 3 months, eventually burning close to 200,000 hectares, with significant impacts to sensitive watersheds, salmon, and wildlife populations and forest ecosystems. The Elephant Hill wildfire was the third largest megafire of that year. And that summer, driven by the combined impacts of climate change and the legacies of close to a century of industrial forest management and fire suppression, a record-breaking 1.2 million hectares burned throughout the province. These megafires prompted a 10-week-long state of emergency, enforcing the evacuation over 165,000 people. I just wanted to take a moment here and to share a story of, these fires just don't impact our land; they impact our people and the emotions and the mental well-being. And a quick story was I was told of a gentleman who was watching his granddaughter playing in the backyard in her little pool, and he could see the smoke rising and the flames coming fast along the grassland behind his backyard. And he had literally seconds to grab his granddaughter out of the backyard, put her in the car, and as he was driving away, in the rearview mirror, watching the flames burn down his home. From my understanding, to this day, he still has not been able to go back to that home just because of the memories and the trauma that is associated with that. Next slide, please.
So this Elephant Hill and the joint recovery process that followed is the focus of this report that we launched last December at Secwepemc, Elephant Hill, Secwepemc Leadership and Lessons Learned from the Collective Story of Wildfire Recovery. In her description of this cover artwork, Secwepemc artist Tanya Willard states that this image reflects stories of Coyote's brother Fox and his ability to regenerate Coyote by jumping over his body. In the wake of the devastation of the fires in Secwepemcúl'ecw, I imagine this fox being able to bring the forest and our foods and the animals back to life and regenerate the health of our ecologies. Using our culture, language, and traditions, and returning to reciprocal and respectful interactions with the ecologies around us, we can regenerate the land for everyone, human and non-human. As a joint project between the SRSS and UBC, guided by the First Nations Technical Table, this report documents both Secwepemc community and provincial government agency experiences of the 2017 fires and offers an in-depth examination of the drivers, successes, challenges, and lessons learned from the government approach to wildfire recovery. Looking forward, it also speaks to Secwepemc visions for wildfire management, land stewardship, and restoration throughout Secwepemcúl'ecw. While the Elephant Hill fire burned close to 200,000 hectares throughout Secwepemcúl'ecw, the vast majority of the fire was centered in Bonaparte First Nations traditional territory. In our interview with former Cookpee of Bonaparte, Ryan Day, he described that first day of July 7th as the fire was roaring up the valley from Ashcroft. He said, "We just watched the fire that night burn up the hill. I think generally Indigenous people deal with emergencies pretty calmly, so we weren't panicking in that way. But even in that first night, we were already feeling the sorrow of what was happening to our land." Over the following months, as tens of thousands of people around the province were forced to evacuate, many Secwepemc people stayed behind to protect their communities. John Liscombe, a forester working for Secwepemc First Nation, described how when everyone got evacuated, we did not evacuate. We ended up fighting 3 or 4 fires around our community for days without any assistance. We felt if we would actually have left, we probably wouldn't have any community to come back to. This feeling of being on your own led to many communities stepping up to play a leadership role in wildfire response. Richardson, for example, activated an emergency operations center and sent teams of experienced range riders and territorial patrol out in the mountains. These fire watchers played a critical role in responding to spot fires, accessing real-time information on fire activity to share back with the wider community, and at times guiding agency staff who were lost in the maze of backroads above the Deadman Valley. Yet time and time again, we heard the same frustrations, that this local knowledge and expertise was ignored or disrespected, to the detriment of fire response. Bert William from Stoughtaus spoke to the impact of these experiences, saying we should have been involved with fighting the fire right from the start and not moved out. They got rid of everybody off the reserve, evacuated everybody. Then you've got people coming in from Australia, from Ontario, from different places. They didn't know anything about our country. To be kicked out of your home and have some stranger come tell you what to do in your backyard, that's what hurt the most, that you're treated like a refugee almost in your own country. The impacts and costs of these fires often are spoken about in numbers that are too impossibly large to make sense of. $500 million in suppression costs, over 1 million hectares burned, millions of trees scorched, or years of timber harvest destroyed. But like Angie hinted at, and for many community members we spoke to, this doesn't even begin to capture the deep and lasting impacts this fire continues to have on their land and on their individual and collective well-being. Jenny Allen from Stuk Towers summed this up clearly by saying, the government needs to understand the impact of this fire on our territories. That is our sustenance, that is our backyards, that is our livelihoods that we'll never see again. Our plants and our foods and our medicines and our culture and everything that is being completely destroyed by the fire. It has huge social, cultural, and economic impacts to us. 70% of our traditional territory is burnt. It is about our rights as Indigenous people living off the land. We don't have the resources to go hunting anymore. Our waters are contaminated. Our fishway has blown out. So Bonaparte in every way has been impacted with our right to use and occupy the land. And I don't think that is taken seriously enough. For then Cook v. Ryan Day, the scope and scale of these impacts also presented a critical opportunity to come together and shape a new approach to recovery. Speaking with us for the report, he said, we just knew that this was a vulnerable ecosystem, so we needed to work together regardless. And so we just decided there was a greater thing that needed to happen here. So within that opportunity for change created by record-breaking fire seasons and a newly elected provincial government, it was that strong leadership from Secwepemc communities that was the driving force behind collaborative recovery. In a letter hand-delivered to Premier Horgan in September 2017, Secwepemc chiefs called on the provincial government to action its commitment to reconciliation by not making any decisions on the land about forest, range, water, or wildlife without engaging with us as the true caretakers. And they call on the government to support Secwepemc people's leadership in the regeneration of the ecosystem affected by Elephant Hill in the months, years, and decades to come. For Secwepemc leadership, wildfire recovery was about more than just putting things back the way they were. They spoke to the broader vision for advancing Secwepemc rights and government-to-government relationships, and the necessary challenge of rebuilding the nation based on Secwepemc laws, language, and ways of understanding. The foundation, as they saw it, for wildfire recovery and long-term stewardship. This meant prioritizing cultural heritage and protecting archaeological sites. It meant spending time to understand shared values and priorities for healing the land. It meant implementing Secwepemc law to manage the impacts and influx of Morel mushroom harvesters, asserting Secwepemc jurisdiction over the understory. However, wildfire recovery was soon reduced to a more reactive approach, addressing immediate issues of fireguard rehabilitation, range recovery, timber salvage. Recovery also focused on things like reforestation, managing beetle outbreaks, and managing access along the hundreds of kilometers of fireguards. This infographic on the left, which we put together for the report, provides an overview of the recovery and rehabilitation activities completed on Elephant Hill. Close to 600 kilometers of fireguards, salvage operations, and guiding species mix, and mitigating further impacts to the over 200 archaeological sites recorded across the fire. And on the right, a photo from the Secwepemc Morel mushroom program, where a permit system was implemented in the absence of provincial or federal laws governing the understory. As Angie said, these activities were guided by this Joint Leadership Council and Joint Technical Committee, and the principles and guidance from this process continue to guide wildfire recovery throughout the province. But again, throughout this whole process, Secwepemc leadership and community members emphasized their goals of using this new approach to address broader issues of forest management and to advance their rights and title across their territory. So while this report looks back to 2017, our focus is on looking forward. It's about acknowledging the successes and changes that have happened since 2017, while highlighting some of the persistent challenges and barriers to achieving true partnerships in wildfire management. And speaking with Bert William during the summer of 2021, as wildfires were once again burning throughout their territory, he expressed a hope that the work done on Elephant Hill has established a process for moving forward, in particular with archaeology. Yet at the same time, he stressed the need to be involved at every step of the way, to avoid creating a sense of emergency to fast-track recovery like salvage in place of meaningful collaboration. Overall, the majority of people we spoke to in the Secwepemc Nation and provincial government felt that that joint process of wildfire recovery was a success. And this value was seen in terms of new relationships and trust, promoting collaboration and a united voice amongst Secwepemc communities, providing economic and training opportunities, and again, supporting Secwepemc-led archaeology. And Joanne Hammond from Richardson Natural Resources spoke to the importance of these relationships, saying, the social and cultural processes that were developed and relationships that were affirmed are absolutely the biggest success. And not because they solved all the problems, but because it established a new way of doing things that will allow us to solve the bigger problems that are coming. And I think often of climate change and the kind of action we're going to have to take collectively to be able to manage the impacts of climate change. It's going to take those kinds of organizations and relationships to do it. We would never be able to tackle it under the old winner-takes-all government regulating industry sort of system and leaving First Nations and communities out of the loop. That was never going to work. So I think that is a major, major victory. So a key takeaway is that building on this model of Elephant Hill means that First Nations, in our case, the Secwepemc Nation, determine this approach for wildfire recovery and collaboration in their territories. And simultaneously, the provincial government and other actors on the land base must spend that time developing shared understandings, principles, and goals with local communities, and to address the legacies and ongoing processes of resource extraction that have created the conditions for these megafires.
Thanks, Sarah. In these next few slides, we're going to be talking about what has happened for the SRSS communities and what are we doing now? What are we achieving beyond the wildfire? Like Sarah says, it's time to move forward and time to move on. And so, you know, we've taken those relationships and that we've built, and we continue to build on those partnerships and the collaboration with the government and other non-geo organizations. We've been partnering with the World Wildlife Federation on carbon initiatives, and we've been doing a BC salmon project and a natural capital evaluation and cultural heritage protocol. So these are all pieces that I'll be speaking to shortly. But, you know, as we move forward, you know, we're always led, all of our restoration is led while incorporating our vision and our mission statements, which Emily had already stated in the beginning, so I'm not going to repeat it for you again. But first of all, I'd like to start off with a slide. This slide actually depicts a 30-year time lapse of the Bonaparte Plateau. And as you can see, over the years, the devastating impact that our forest management and forest practices have imparted on our landscape. And I think we really need to consider, you know, when we're considering wildfire recovery, we look at it as part of a broader context of a landscape recovery and addressing not only the immediate impacts, but to these wildfires, but also to our forest management practices and planning processes that have contributed to the conditions for these megafires to occur. So I'll just let that sink in a little bit because it's pretty profound. Perfect, thank you. So this leads us to our current BC Salmon Restoration Innovation Initiative. Oh my gosh, I'm tongue-tied today. This initiative brought $2.6 million to restore and enhance fish populations within the Elephant Hill wildfire area. It's a 5-year project, and it's a landscape scale ecosystem-based approach. It's involving all of our communities that were affected by the Elephant Hill wildfire, and it's to restore, monitor, and do stakeholder engagement, and just looking at new and innovative ways to restore our riparian areas and critical salmon habitat. This project will restore riparian vegetation and in-stream fish habitat in high value and or sensitive areas. It enhances the collaboration between our First Nations and our private landholders, the province and federal governments, universities, and non-government organizations. We've also seen a lot of training and capacity building within our communities, and it also improving understanding of post-fire riparian recovery to inform our future operations. There's a quote here from a gentleman by the name of Jimmy Rosette. He was a community member and field technician with Secwepemc Nation, yes, thank you. First Nation, Canoe Creek, Dog Creek, Indian Band. He spent a field season conducting riparian surveys for this riparian restoration project and described the big benefit of being able to have input on what they put back along the creeks and rivers along there, and to have the input on what the country's going to look like in the future. Next slide. The other piece that we wanted to look at is taking an evaluation of what was lost during the fires. It was brought to our table a company by the name of Solstice Sustainability, and they've created a natural capital evaluation process, which will help us identify the things that we lost in the fire and the things that were that are most important to our community. So this natural capital refers to an area stock of natural resources that provides benefits to people like geology, soil, air, water, and all living things, and kind of similar to the Secwepemc term living infrastructure. This natural capital stock provides annual flows of an ecosystem services. So also looking not only for the ecosystem for its natural essence, but also to what we lost from an economic point of view as well. Some of those categories of our ecosystem servicing are provisioning and food and water, regulating flood moderation, climate regulation, habitat, and cultural pieces, which leads us into our next slide. In the spring of 2021, the Secwepemcúl'ecw Restoration and Stewardship Society and the staff from the Forest Range and Evaluation Program, known as the FREP, had met to discuss issues around the FREP protocol for cultural heritage resources and stewardship monitoring, and the influence that it has on First Nations efforts to conservation and protection of cultural heritage in the Secwepemc territory. This meeting was prompted by the province and ministry's challenges in meeting the needs of Indigenous nations and communities for this project, specifically the Secwepemc, as it relates to the assessments and impacts of current forest and range management practices. So this is an opportunity for our Secwepemc Nation to redefine and take ownership of cultural heritage assessments and evaluations, to lay the foundation of what a Secwepemc-focused cultural heritage protocol assessment and future protocol would look like. This process has seen all 17 of our communities sit at a table and have these ongoing discussions around cultural heritage, the definition of cultural heritage, and what that means as a community and also as a nation. So this is an opportunity for our communities to really highlight and emphasize what is truly valuable to them Next slide. So in 2021, the Secwepemc communities and territories were once again devastated by wildfires. While the Secwepemc people witnessed the devastation to their territories, Indigenous communities worldwide were already starkly aware of how colonial forest management, informed by Western state and scientific knowledge systems that are deeply connected to the colonization of lands and mines, had failed. With accelerating impacts of climate change, altering fire regimes, and compounding the ongoing impacts of colonialization on Indigenous communities, there's a critical need to restore relationships of respect and reciprocity with the land through the interconnected processes of Indigenous-led restoration and reconciliation. Next slide.
So while showed is maybe not new, we're seeing it increasingly with every year of megafires in BC. Perhaps one thing that was new last year was this increasing media and public attention to this need to work with Indigenous communities, to recognize their expertise and leadership in fire and wildfire response. So this map taken from Twitter shows the wildfire, the Sparks Lake fire, spotting to the edge of Secwepemc Reserve. And this photo was taken by Ron Ignace of that same fire burning over the hills above his home. With the majority of the community once again evacuated under the direction of Chief and Council, Secwepemc's fire watchers and fire crews once again played a critical role in protecting their community. Eventually, after some struggle, working hand in hand with BC Wildfire to support fire suppression and response. In an interview conducted by Ron Ignace with the BC Wildfire Division Supervisor on Sparks Lake, that division supervisor highlighted what he saw as the critical importance of this collaboration with Secwepemc and of Secwepemc member and Territorial Patrol Daryl Peters' knowledge of fire. This BC Wildfire Service employee said, "Daryl knows more about fire than I will ever learn. He's probably forgotten more about fire than I will ever learn. So Daryl is with me many days in the sky, helping me, guiding me, showing me how the landscape is going to react and transform under the energy of this fire. By utilizing traditional knowledge and guiding us in where to essentially put that fire down, he went out and he showed us how to pull sagebrush efficiently and easily. He showed us the good line to take that will hold better. He's even shown us how to stay cool in a desert landscape, using his knowledge on how to stay cool and stay safe." However, despite people like this increasingly recognizing the importance of working with and for Secwepemc communities, we heard again an ongoing sense of frustration that communities still had to fight for this level of involvement. Throughout the Secwepemc Nation and BC more broadly, these concerns echoed those from 2017, that the changeover of fire agency staff poses a barrier to relationship building and trust, that there are inconsistent approaches or different levels of willingness of agency staff to seek local input, poor communication with local communities around evacuation, and concerns regarding the extensive use or misapplication of prescribed fire, in this case backburning. And once again, this highlights the need for greater relationship building and planning prior to a fire season, something that the SRSS is now working closely with communities and BC Wildfire to move forward.
Here we have a photo of former Cook Ron. I think he's doing some grass burning in his backyard, which leads us to, for millennia, cultural burning was a common form of vegetation management by Indigenous peoples, including Secwepemc, across the dry forests and grasslands of BC. Fire stimulated the growth of important food and medicine plants and ungulate forage and created that well-kept park-like appearance that we no longer see today, as Indigenous burning was outlawed in BC in the late 19th century, followed by more than a century of colonial fire suppression that further disrupted historical fire regimes. Future restoration of such fire-adapted ecosystems must support Indigenous peoples in reclaiming fire and land stewardship practices and be informed by diverse knowledges of the ecological and cultural histories. The future of our ecosystems depends on the revival of cultural burning practices. Restoring fire-adapted ecosystems throughout the Secwepemcúl'ecw is one of the main goals of our communities. Unfortunately, we are still overcoming significant barriers and continued lack of understanding or respect for the Indigenous knowledge and fire expertise. Next slide, please. We have a beautiful photo, walking on two legs. Worldwide, Indigenous peoples are leading the revitalization of our cultures through the restoration of ecosystems in which they are embedded, including in response to increasing megafires. Concurrently growing Indigenous-led movements are calling for governments to implement Indigenous rights, titles, and treaties, and many settler colonial governments are committing to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and to implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yet despite growing recognition that just and effective conservation is only possible through partnerships with or led by Indigenous peoples, decolonizing approaches to restoration have received insufficient attention. However, reconciliation will be incomplete without Indigenous-led restoration of Indigenous lands, knowledges, and cultures. Thus, the concept of walking on two legs, to guide restoration scientists and practitioners in advancing the interconnected processes of Indigenous-led restoration and reconciliation in Indigenous territories. As an action-oriented framework articulated by the Secwepemc elder Ronald Ignace, walking on two legs seeks to bring Indigenous knowledges into balance with Western scientific knowledge in service of upholding an Indigenous stewardship ethic that is embedded in Indigenous ways of relating to land and embodies principles of respect, reciprocity, can't wrap my words around that, mouth around that today, and responsibility. Grounding the context of fire-adapted ecosystems of Western Canada and unceded and traditional Secwepemc territory. Secwepemcúl'ecw, we argue that walking on two legs, along with principles of reconciliation, offers a pathway to uphold respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples, knowledges, and territories through Indigenous-led restoration. That expert was from a document that was drafted by Sarah Dickson-Hoyle and Mary Ann and Ron Ignace.
So we want to close with a quote from Ryan Day, speaking to what he saw as the real need and the driver for this collaborative approach, not just to wildfire recovery, but also to long-term restoration. And he says, we want the control and resources to do it right, not just the outcome-based, but the identity that comes with doing that work, the skills, the way that it helps people to live and rebuild who we are and our relationship to the land. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was a wonderful presentation. Really helped to illuminate a lot of what's in the report, and always engaging to hear it from your voices instead of just reading. I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking about how you see this, what will likely be another fire season coming up, how that might be handled in terms of the provincial government supporting this work that you're doing.
Well, it's been a slow process, but Sarah and I and Shar-John have been connecting with the provincial government, BC Wildfire, and some of the regional zone managers, starting that process of building relationships. And I think it's really key for moving forward is to have those relationships. A lot of times we see books or binders on the shelf highlighting contacts and information of communities, and they just sit on that shelf. And until you actually can put a face to that book, that you actually truly get an understanding of what that First Nation community can offer in the support of wildfire. So really looking at building on those relationships. Our first goal, I know wildfire season is going to be coming upon us really quickly here. And so, just really trying to see getting meetings with the communities and building on that relationship and identifying areas where each of those communities can help support BC Wildfire, and just really providing those relationships, looking at the equipment lists, and yeah, just trying to build on that. Sarah could probably build on that too.
I think you've covered that well.
We've got a question from Mike Lorock. Mike says, great presentation. Thank you very much. 582 kilometers of fire guard rehabilitated. Do you have an idea of the total amount of fire guard on the Elephant Hill fire?
On the Elephant Hill fire, there was 1,600 kilometers of fire guard.
I'll just actually just clarify that though. They did actually, so the communities, when they did the surveys along the fire guards, the preliminary field reconnaissance, obviously had to walk in many cases up and back. So that number for the fire guards rehabilitated is actually the total number that was constructed, but communities had to survey a much longer length. Wow. So it just speaks to the amount of work that had to be put in afterwards to try and mitigate further impacts like landslides and flooding that we see after fires. But I think it also speaks to the importance of actually working with local communities, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to guide where those fire guards can be placed. There was that quote from the BC Wildfire Service Division Supervisor saying, Daryl Peters has been able to show us where to lay down a good line to stop that fire. So rather than plowing 600 kilometers down to bare mineral soil across these sensitive watersheds, if you work with local communities that have knowledge of that land, that can also try and avoid sensitive sites, try and avoid impacting archaeological sites or sensitive streams in the first place. So I think, perhaps no one was prepared for 2017, but I think we're beyond the point of saying this is unprecedented or that we're not prepared. And I think it's kind of beyond excuses to not be working with local communities and putting in that upfront planning.
Mm-hmm. We have the artist Kelly Richardson, whose work we're currently exhibiting in the Central Gallery, has a comment here saying she didn't know about the role of the fox in the artwork for the report. There's a distant fox crying and calling in Halo, one of the works that she made that speaks to the wildfires of 2021. It's interesting necessity there.
Yeah.
This has been absolutely incredible. People are putting in more questions. Do you have time for another question?
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
3.
From Kathy Hall-Patch, is there a specific person in each of the Indigenous communities that BC Wildfire contacts when a fire is in their area?
Go ahead, Sarah.
This speaks to this idea of fire liaisons in community. Fire liaisons are not a new concept in BC Wildfire. They often identify someone from a local community, for example, to kind of liaise between the local incident management teams. But it's something that happens in some areas. BC Wildfire kind of talking about this as a new program, but again, it's really not consistent. And so something we're really pushing for is one, to sit down with communities and identify ideally a number of people who could serve as that key contact point or liaison during a fire season, but then also ensuring there's adequate training within fire agencies themselves to be really clear on what that role is about. It's not just about a one-way information exchange back to communities. It's actually about sharing that knowledge and ensuring those liaisons from communities, if they wish, because every community will have different priorities as to how they want to be involved, making sure that they're actually have that decision-making role, are at the decision-making table, determining like tactical suppression activities or whatever it is that they can share. So it's slowly, but it's definitely a real priority, and we're pushing for it to move forward much quicker.
Mm-hmm. Chair Neville says, I understand that the Thompson-Nicola Regional District recently committed to a year-round wildfire team. Do you think this shift reflects a new understanding about the need for ongoing stewardship of the land that looks to the future rather than just reacting each year? Absolutely.
I think it was music to my ears to hear that this is going to be funded year-round. I've been saying that since 2017, that we need to have that level of funding and resources year long, and not being put into a situation at the beginning of wildfire season every year and them scrambling to find resources. I mean, that was one of the things we heard again this year. I was impacted again this year in 2021, evacuated from my home with the White Rock Lake fire. And again, we were hearing from them, we just don't have enough resources. We just don't have enough resources. Well, it's making sure that those resources are there all the time. So they're not scrambling at the beginning of every year trying to build those resources and bring them in at the last minute. And I mean, it saw, a lot of times things like, for example, equipment that isn't running, it's brought to the site and they're working on it for 2 days before. That's not efficient and effective. We need things that are going to hit the ground running right away. And so hearing that there's been this commitment has been a big relief. And we're hoping that, with having these conversations with the BC Wildfire early on, that we can continue having these conversations year long and not just when they're in session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, that's great to hear. The regional district is looking to go. I'm not familiar with what's happening with the Thompson-Nicola Regional District. There's been a lot of coverage of this announcement through the budget and the kind of BC Wildfire going year round. I mean, they are a year-round organization anyway. They just lay off a lot of their seasonal staff outside of the fire season. So I think the key thing to keep an eye on is, where is that additional funding going? Are we just trying to build kind of suppression capacity year round? California, for example, are struggling to hire firefighters because of the burnout and the incredibly challenging conditions they're having. And so we can't just be putting all of our additional resources into suppression. We need to be investing in people that can actually work with communities, that can put funding into that upfront planning, to put funding into mitigation work. We think of close to $1 billion in each of 3 of the last 5 years. Imagine if even just 10% of that funding were put into preparedness and mitigation activities.
I just want to elaborate on that too. Like, it's, I think people need to realize that fires don't start in cities, they start in rural communities. And a lot of our First Nation communities are rural communities, and giving them the capacity, the skills that they need to be the first on that fire, I think will help mitigate and impact the devastation of those fires. Like, it's just, I think having them front and center and being able to attack early on, will limit the amount of these mega fires that we're seeing. It's right now they're all being told to stand down and let it sit for 3 or 4 days. Well, by then it's blown up. And that's what we saw at the White Rock Lake fire. We just don't have the resources, just sit for a minute. And whereas we could have had other communities in there and fighting that fire and being put down. I think, it's taking a look at their budgets and, like Sarah said, and seeing where that money is going, where that money's going, and what the most impact that money will have. And for us, I think it's building capacity within our rural communities and our First Nations communities, and having them as our frontline attack.
Do you see a move towards decriminalizing Indigenous burning?
There are some promising developments from other jurisdictions. California last year passed 2 Senate bills addressing the liability issue. So essentially, the state is taking on liability for escape prescribed burns in 2 cases. One, if it was conducted by essentially a certified burn boss, following procedure, no negligence, or if it was a cultural burn implemented by an Indigenous fire practitioner. And that Indigenous fire practitioner is not defined by the state, it's defined by the tribes. So that's been a long time coming. There's been a lot of advocacy from some key people down in California and some really active nations down there. I think there are a lot of barriers still in British Columbia, and actually there's a paper and analysis on those barriers, and also kind of calls to action to overcome those that'll be coming out really soon. That's been a collaborative piece between Indigenous and non-Indigenous practitioners across Canada. So I still think there are a lot of liability. People are really concerned. There's a lot of barriers to accessing training. You can only become a burn boss essentially if you're within government. And, you know, there are opportunities within reserve lands, but within broader territories, there's still a lot of jurisdictional barriers, I think. But there are instances of nations that are overcoming that. Secwepemc, for example, within the tidal lands.
We've got a section in the exhibition resource area where we're encouraging folks to write to their provincial and federal representatives. Is this a scenario where individuals writing to government might have some impact? Is this something we can help lobby for, or is that not really the way the process works?
Oh, well, everything helps, right? I mean, you know, that's one of the things we have found as communities that have come together is we have a stronger voice united than we do apart. And we have seen and have invoked change within our traditional territories by standing together and being united in our thoughts and our processes and our message. And we have seen some changes. I mean, slow and small, but we are seeing change. And we're grateful for that. And we're happy that we're moving in that direction.
Great. Mike Lorock says, looking at the first 3 months of this year, has the level of practical community planning improved over previous years, in your opinion?
Yeah, I definitely. I think all of our communities, like right now, we've got Sketchison Indian Band is unfortunately and sadly preparing for evacuation due to slides from this past year's fire. As we are all aware, that Sparks Lake fire was right within their, came right down onto their reserve. However, they were able to mitigate the impacts. However, the conditions of that fire will be seeing them having many floods this year. So, you know, I think we're, you know, our past years of wildfires and what we see happening after the fires are preparing us to some degree. I mean, I think we saw that last fall with the flooding down at the coast. And I mean, that hit us. I mean, that was devastating as well. But these are all symptoms of wildfires and the impacts that have happened. And you know, I think a lot of our communities are taking note of what has happened to other neighboring communities and are preparing and looking at their community. How can we best mitigate against fire? Looking down, taking care of fuel issues, making sure that there's a guard around their communities, being prepared with wildfire personnel or some level of being able or being emergency prepared. I think that has gone up a notch or two in priorities for communities, and really making sure that that we're not seeing any loss of lives, or that we're being prepared for what's happening. So yes, we do see that coming within our communities.
Awesome. This has been fantastic. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate you sharing your breadth of knowledge with us. For anybody who has not already been into the exhibition, Angela very kindly provided a printed copy of this report. So we have that in the resource area for you to read. It's also on their website. And you can see the entirety of that video that they shared at the beginning on their website as well. For anybody who wasn't able to make it, if you want to share this with your friends, we are recording today. It'll take me about a week to edit it, and then I'll get it up online. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Great. Thank you for having us. Bye.